Section 27 of Crime, Its Causes and Remedies by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information on the volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 9. Absurdities and Contradictions in Criminal Procedure. Subchapter 192. Our methods and expedients in criminal procedure are no better than we have seen our penal institutions to be. Decisions in criminal cases are nothing more than a game of chance, where nothing is certain but the publicity which leads to new crimes. Subchapter 193. The Jury. The lack of uniformity in the verdicts brought in by juries in different years and different countries shows the inefficiency of the institution. Thus, Cagliari reckons that there are 50% of acquittals, while Upper Italy shows but 23%. Venice shows a difference of 9% to 15% as we pass from the small towns to the large ones. The cultivated classes, says Tiani, are never represented on the jury. And in fact, numerous cases prove to us only too clearly the complete ignorance of jurymen. Thus, in a vote with regard to a homicide, a ballot was found on which was written yes or no. It was counted in favour of the prisoner. When the juror was asked why he had written so strange a vote, he answered, because the ballot had printed on it, the juror must answer yes or no. There is no guarantee of the incorruptibility of the jurymen, who, having no account to render and nothing to lose by an acquittal, often levies tribute upon justice, as is proved by numerous acquittals secured by bribery, even after the criminal has confessed. More than this, the jury of itself is a case of popular corruption. Borghetti notes that many respectable peasants are corrupted by serving on the jury, and he adds, it is the area where the mafia achieves its triumphs. Moreover, the injustice towards the poor that springs from that corruption is a great cause of immorality, for the poor accused person, seeing that justice quite other than equal for all, believes himself almost justified in indemnifying himself at the expense of a society which has condemned him, and regards his sentence as unjust, even when it is not. In answer to those who maintain that juries are a guarantee of free government, we may recall that the history of England shows us how often juries change their opinion according to the will of the government. But besides, what has this argument to do with cases that are not political? Furthermore, in those cases where the government remains quite indifferent, public opinion, to which the most respectable juries are involuntarily subservient, is often easily misled by criminals and their defenders. And where will you find a greater tyranny than that of ignorance? The jury, writes Pieronti, often acquits the man who steals the public money for the purpose of protesting against the government, or perhaps acquits a criminal because he was a brave soldier. I will add that this excessive mildness in dealing with criminals leads them to new crimes, and we may understand why in a brawl a comrade of the aggressor said to him, kill him and you will have a jury trial. If you merely wound him, you will go to the police magistrate. Where a matter must above all be decided on its merits without any reference to feeling, it is not the direct opposite of justice to leave it to be decided by popular instinct, by the feeling that happens to predominate in the crowd at the moment. And what can be done about the errors of the jury, springing often from cases that it is impossible to foresee, as in the Giletti case in Brescia, where a blot of ink upon the yes of a juryman caused the acquittal of a man who ought to have been condemned to death. It is vain to urge in support of the jury the necessity of modernizing the process of justice. As well as other institutions, the jury existed already through a rudimentary form at the time of the 12 Tables and the Germanic Gericht. It is just as modern as cremation, the pretended innovation of the modern pseudo-hygienists, which was already ancient in the time of Homer and quite as commendable in practice. Have we not done everything to bind upon magistrates the duty of justifying, giving the reasons of their decisions, and of not giving them in the form of oracles? This notwithstanding the guarantees offered by their past, by their special studies, by their experience, by the fact that appeal may be taken from their decisions. And then we think we have discovered a new source of liberty and justice in permitting men without experience, without responsibility, to sentence by a simple yes or no, like children of despots, without giving any reason for their acts. And in Italy we aggravate the evil by decreeing that this irresponsible sentence shall be revocable when it is in favour of the criminal, and leave subject to appeal when it is against him. Every magistrate must justify the condemnation or acquittal which he pronounces for libel, theft, or assault. But when it is a question of robbery or murder, the popular magistracy gives its decision without any other guarantee or reason than a yes or no. Worse than that, the juror may still more easily let the criminal go unpunished by casting a blank ballot, which, even if the law does not interpret it as a definite expression, in the conscience of an ignorant juryman who is inclined to make mental reservations, is always a compromise between truth and injustice. If even these precautions prescribed by law to prevent the inconveniences of the jury system were only observed, one of the most important assuredly is that the jury shall communicate with no one until they have pronounced their verdict. They take an oath to observe this obligation, but in reality, as all the world knows, they do not keep it and communicate, even publicly, with the counsel for the defense. While on the other hand, should the right of exclusion without cause be given to the defendant who challenges the better jurors, just those who, by their honourable character and their intelligence, would be most capable of resisting seduction and rhetoric? How can we believe that an ignorant man could follow a trial like that at Ancona, in which 147 witnesses were interrogated and 5,000 questions laid before the jury? Furthermore, how shall those who have nothing to lose by acquitting resist threats of death, even when responsible judges allow themselves to be intimidated? And finally, if tried judges, even an assembly of experts, can in certain crimes hardly disentangle the truth, which can only be understood through a knowledge of toxicology, surgery, and psychiatry, how can it be done by individuals who are not only not specialists, but quite ignorant of any science whatever? And this at a time when division of labour is required in things much less important than justice. Are we not abandoning to chance something that ought to be conducted according to the strictest rules? Objection is made, it is true, that the average number of acquittals in jury trials is no larger than those cases decided by the judge. This objection is far from being exact, for the average in some regions is twice as great. Even if it were true, there is a great difference between the two cases. Before a case is brought to trial before a jury, it is already being submitted to a long series of tests and judgments such as those of the praetor, the examining judge, the royal procurator, the section of acquisition, the president of the court, the procurator general, experts, etc. After all these, it is difficult for any proof of the innocence of the accused person to arise, for there is not so much in regard to number as to quality that the acquittals are at fault. They show a deplorable generosity toward murderers, homicides, and those guilty of insurrection, and also by an unfortunate perversion toward forgers and persons who steal public money, a fact which is certainly one of the causes of the constant increase of crimes of this kind. The objection that in England and America the jury system works well has no weight. In the Anglo-Saxon race, the feeling for justice and duty does not fall as often as it does with us. Further, they do not try by jury those who have confessed their guilt, while with us these cases, which amount to half the total number, give rise to the greatest scandals. Then there is a smaller number of criminals tried by jury in England, 1 to 132,770 inhabitants, while in Italy there is 1 for each 8,931, an enormous difference not sufficiently accounted for by our greater criminality. In England, moreover, in many cases such as insurrections, bankruptcies, etc., there are special juries, and the habeas corpus does not forbid, as some imagine, preventive arrest by the police, but gives the accused the right to secure within 24 hours the intervention of the magistracy, High Court of London or the County Court, to decide whether his detention should be contained or revoked. In all difficult cases, the coroner calls about him a veritable jury of specialists, physicians, or chemists. The jurors, moreover, take oath to conform to the instructions of the judge with regard to the law and keep the oath scrupulously, thanks to their respect for the law. Public opinion in England, moreover, would revolt against a previous verdict in which the instructions of the judge on points of law were disregarded. Besides this, if the verdict appears unjust, the judge can suspend the execution of it, at least until it has been sanctioned by his colleagues. We may add that the jury cannot leave the courthouse until the verdict has been rendered, a measure that prevents many bad influences. But even in England, the jury system is not without its objectors. As early as the time of Elizabeth, they used against the jury the words heard by Cicero against corrupt magistrates. Quas fames magis quam fama commovere, and in 1824, the Westminster Review attacked the jury system violently and went so as to call it The Phantom of Justice. Subchapter 194. Appeal. Injustice makes judgment bitter, wrote Bacon. Delay turns it sour. As much may be said nowadays when, thanks to appeals, the penalty is no longer either prompt, certain, or severe, and whereas the judgment of the trial court is preceded by a regular, complete argument, that of the appellate court is based merely upon a written statement of the cause, often very irregularly and incompletely drawn up. This fatal edifice is crowned by the most ample right to reverse the decisions of the lower court, not based, as would be just. Justice is the practice in America, England, and even France, upon substantial errors and errors of fact, but almost always upon matters of form, on account of which a very costly judgment may be reversed for a simple mistake in grammar made by an unfortunate clerk. Subchapter 195. Pardon. As if the right of appeal were not enough, we have also the right of pardon so profusely employed in Italy that pardons are here 100 times as numerous as they are in France. Now, how can we reconcile this clemency with the rarity of cases of moral reform? Who is not aware that criminals liberated after having passed through the graduated prison system, which is much more of a test than simple imprisonment, still give very poor results? How can we say that justice is equal for that it is destined to bring the disturbed juridical condition to equilibrium, and that it is based upon fixed, immutable laws, free from all personal influence, when all that is needed to blot out the whole thing is a simple stroke of the pen, the signature of a man who may be the best man in the country, but is after all only a man? The system of pardons is founded upon a supposition that the right to punish exists only in the will of the ruler. But we use it to mitigate justice when it is too severe, answers Frederick. Very well, if that is so, you have not true justice, and you ought to change its methods, says Filangieri. Every pardon granted to a criminal is a derogation of the law, for if the pardon is just, the law is bad, and if the law is just, the pardon is an attack upon the law. By the first hypothesis, laws should be abolished, and by the second, pardons. We may add as a last consideration that pardons are contrary to the spirit of equality and animates modern society, for when it favours the rich, as is too often the case, it makes the poor suspect that there is no justice for them. Rousseau's words in this connection may be remembered. Frequent pardons announce that crimes will soon have no further need of them, and everyone knows whither that leads. Subchapter 196. Criminological Prejudices. It is still worse that there should be installed into judicial practice a series of prejudices which make every judgment useless. We deplore, for example, the principle that when there is a doubt as to the intent of the criminal, he must be presumed to have had the less evil intent, that when we cannot prove two of the crimes he was aiming at, we must always presume that it was the less serious. Now it is the contrary of this that is the case with born criminals. The law, then, by following an hypothesis that is the direct opposite of the fact, endangers the safety of society. But it is still worse when the law is more lenient with attempted crimes, when it denies the intention, even when the criminal has betrayed it by his threats and by his steps which he has taken to put it into execution. Thus, one who administers a substance that he believes to be poisonous, when it is not, is guilty from the point of view of common sense, which does not stop for the magic formulas of the old jurists, for he is dangerous as if he had administered a real poison. The more so, since we know the pertinacity with which prisoners repeat their crimes on a large scale. To take the opposite position is virtually and insist on seeing the victim quite dead before taking steps to protect him. This is to rob ourselves, through love of abstract theories, of a practical and concrete means of protection. So much the more since we know the tendency of the born criminal to divulge his own crimes before committing them. Further, it is absurd that our laws should be milder towards recidivists who do not fall again into the same crimes. They are no less dangerous on that account, but quite the contrary. The English statistics show that those who have committed crimes against persons upon relapsing commit more especially crimes against property in order to escape justice. The criminal who always relapses into the same crimes is almost always a semi-imbecile, perhaps less dangerous. For such the increase of the penalty is less urgent, while the man who at short intervals commits several kinds of crimes shows greater intelligence and greater versatility in crime. Since word lacunaire Gasparoni, Desrues, and Holmes, who knew how to combine theft, swindling, and poisoning with forgery and assassination. Men of this sort are the most dangerous and the hardest to recognize and arrest. Again, the importance that is assigned to public trials is in error. The public trial is almost always only a useless and often dangerous repetition of the recorded results of the preliminary investigation, for the witnesses simply repeat their depositions, which are already on the record. Now, it is difficult for the memory not to become confused before an imposing tribunal, where the crowd is annoying and the lawyers ask captions or even threatening questions, while it is much easier to recollect and recount a fact exactly in a small room before 2 or 3 persons only. The same may be said of the arguments of prosecution and defense, and this with the more reason because the written argument, which is an immense advance on the spoken one, is permanent, and the memory for words is much weaker than that for things. According to the experiments of Munstenberg and Bingham, the average in areas of memory is greater for the auditory series, 31.6%, than is for the visual series, 20.5%. The vaunted oral trial is, then, absolutely contrary to modern progress, however much it may be regarded as one of the pillars of justice. Finally, when we cannot clearly prove that the person accused is a recidivist, or even when his crime has been committed in youth, we should at least take account where all his evil antecedents in order to class him among suspects. What we want to arrive at is the degree of fear with which the individual must be inspired to keep him from doing harm, and the legislator does not believe that anthropological and psychological characteristics may be of service to him in solving the question, he ought at least to reject the demonstrated criminological facts. Subchapter 197. Erroneous Theories. There are many jurists who are deeply versed in scientific matters and the current of the scientific movement with regard to the criminal, who have not been able to gauge its depth accurately for want of physiological ideas or of direct contact. These men have maintained that the great numbers of insane and feeble-minded to be found among criminals, and consequently the limited responsibility of many criminals for their crimes, lead inevitably to the reduction of the penalty. They do not understand that the new anthropological notions, while diminishing the guilt of the born criminal, impose upon us at the same time the duty of prolonging his sentence, because the more irresponsible criminals are, the more they are to be dreaded, since their innate and atavistic criminal tendencies can be neutralized only by selection and sequestration. These tendencies are like a swelling wave, which is turned back upon itself when it encounters a strong dike, but which sweeps on and becomes threatening if nothing checks it. Our jurists have not limited the Dutch, but have thought that they could check the evil by lowering the dikes more and more, hence the increasing tendency to give every opportunity of defense to the criminal and to facilitate pardons, while nothing is done to increase the security of society and the certainty of the repression of crime. Now, if a general relying upon the power of philosophy allowed himself to be guided solely by that, or by an abstract strategy founded upon the history of ancient battles, without regard to modern ballistics, it is not certain that he would conduct his unfortunate soldiers to an inevitable death. Now, a penal justice requires at least as much practical knowledge as does military strategy. Metaphysics in this matter can only be a negative resource, yet the practical results must often depend upon the opinion of persons, venerable indeed, but inclined to substitute metaphysics for strategy, who dream with open eyes of free will independent of matter, and of a right to punish based not upon pressing social necessity, but upon abstract violations of juridical order. Not only do they not think of eliminating the true causes of crime, such as alcoholism, associations of children, etc., but by introducing precipitately all the innovations that the civilized world has contrived in favor of the criminal. They forget the precautions necessary to mitigate the evil consequences of these intermediate institutions for conditional liberation, etc., and they forget finally the new means devised for the defense of society. It is also to be deplored that the high priests of justice regard the form procedure of more importance than the protection of society, so that it has passed into a proverb that the forms more than the substance of the procedure are a supreme guarantee for both parties, and that form dat est rei, 4 words that are the greatest proof of human blindness in juridical matters. Subchapter 198. Cause of this state of things. The cause of this fatal retrogression toward theory is to be sought, first of all, in that law of inertia and exaggerated conservatism by means of which a man, when he has been drawn along by extraordinary circumstances or by bold and fortunate rebels, turns back with terror from every change, however simple and logical, and even in some cases men submit to the change, notwithstanding their repugnance, is because the time is so ripe, and the innovation so apt, that they are carried along in spite of themselves, and forced to accept it. But here, as in religion or philosophy, the truth is hidden by formulas, whose mystic and imposing appearance prevents the discovery of their insubstantial character. Whoever, with uplifted religious feelings, hears for the first time rabbis or Brahmins reciting mysteriously their Hebrew or Sanskrit prayers, attaches to them a profound significance, whereas if translated into the vulgar tongue, they would appear quite simple. In the same way, the public does not understand the legal vocabulary, and finds the jurist the more profound the less it understands him. Often jurists do the same, and think more of themselves, the more they entangle themselves in their hieroglyphics. We understand from this why it is that the public cannot take jurists seriously when they affirm, for example, that to authorize another person to commit a crime is not to be guilty of an overt act, or that when a convict's second offence is different from the first, he is not a recidivist. Ferrero finds another cause for these errors in indo-emotional inactivity, in a tendency of the human mind to reduce to a minimum the number of mental associations necessary for any work whatever. In practice, then, the literal interpretation of the law prevails over all considerations of justice. This is the case with the bureaucracy of great governments. We know that the most common voice of this class of functionaries is the habit of applying literally the rules and laws given for their guidance. For these can be but the imperfect indications of the will of the lawmakers, who, not being able to foresee everything, can only lay down general rules. The official ought to interpret these general rules according to the particular case, but instead, the letter of the rule becomes standard truth and even reason itself. The employee of a private establishment with an eye to his own interests does not let himself so easily fall into the habit of carrying out a general rule without reflection, but interprets the directions he receives according to the circumstances of the case. Now, what happens to codified laws which are supposed to serve merely to guide the magistrate in particular cases is they become justice to him even when applied to the letter. To decide conscientiously, the judge ought to make himself a personal criterion for the special case that he has under his eyes, and judge it according to the general spirit that emanates from the written law. The Roman jurisconsults also recognized that the civil law needed to be supplanted by what they call the natural law, which was nothing else than the expression of that feeling of justice that revolts against the application of general rules to particular cases to which they are not adapted. But all this requires an intense intellectual effort, a fatiguing labour accompanied by a tormenting sense of responsibility. It is much easier and more convenient to apply the general directions of the law by deducing their logical consequences. As soon as the mind has become accustomed to this way of working, a professional ideo-emotional stagnation is produced, which leads the judge to consider the literal application of the law as his whole duty. He soon comes to exclude every collateral idea that might lead to an equitable solution of the question. The amount of injuries suffered by the victim and the causes which brought about the crime are not in any way taken into account. These considerations help us understand why the sciences all began with a deductive method. Even the physical sciences, which form the nature of their subject, would naturally hold themselves closer to nature, started with deduction. Primitive physics and chemistry, for example, consisted of a series of deductions drawn by force of logic from a principle established by the observation of facts at random. It was only later that men came to realize the fact that to learn the laws of nature it is necessary to reason less and to observe more. In the beginning, pure logic was preferred to observation and experience, because it was a less fatiguing psychological process, accepting the presence of a smaller number of intellectual elements in the mind. The employment of pure logic is, then, the effect of an ideo-emotional inactivity proper to the period of infancy, which appears in the period of old age by the well-known law of degeneracy and atavism. What is the science of the Middle Ages but an invasion of Greek subtlety into the field which the thought of antiquity properly submitted to the method of observation? Just so the absolutism of the deductive method in modern judicial sense is a sign of decrepitude. The law of ideo-emotional inactivity explains to us why so often the law of rude and barbarous peoples is distinguished by a certain sound common sense, as compared with the marvellously logical but marvellously absurd subtleties of the law of the most civilized peoples. End of section 27.